Hi, welcome back to another episode of the Landscape Architecture Podcast. I'm Cheris, and today we have a few new faces with us. So let's start with the students. Do you guys want to introduce yourself?
Okay, hi everyone, I'm Sandy, and right now I'm a year 3 landscape architect bachelor. Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Latif. I'm also a year 3 bachelor in landscape architecture student.
Okay, so I'm Cheris. I think you've seen me before in previous episodes. And today we have our very special guest, Dorothy, with us. So Dorothy, maybe you can... we should describe Dorothy first. So maybe the students use one word to describe Dorothy, and maybe a few sentences to back up why.
So Dorothy took us in year 1, Sem 1 for the introduction to landscape architecture. It was kind of my top module during that semester. I really liked it because every time, it was on Zoom unfortunately, so you wouldn't meet face, but I really liked it because, the word first. So the word that I would describe Dorothy would be, it's just simple, it's exciting. Yeah, I always looked forward to what you had to say on the content of the week and what we had to think about, the readings and all that. I just liked it. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Now I'm so embarrassed.
Yeah. Latif?
I think for me, one word, I think the word would be, in the most positive way, is actually intimidating. Because I think the first time I met her, I met her on Zoom, half of our lesson last 2 semesters was on Zoom, and then she came over to Singapore. Finally, she was able to come over to Singapore. And I think what was very intimidating about her was, in a positive way, it was literally the amount of knowledge that she knows, and the questions that she asks is not usually something that most of the other lecturers would ask. It really got us thinking. So
it's just very thought-provoking.
Yeah,
right?
it was
That's right.
to get us to reflect on the topics and the readings, and also to reflect on us as designers, what we are going to be achieving in our lives. So I thought that was it's intimidating in a good way because you challenge yourself. At least how I see it is I want to challenge myself, and I thought that was kind of cool. I really enjoyed intro.
Well, thank you. I just feel like it was the first semester that you were at NUS, so it's easy to impress, right? But no, it was really fun teaching you guys. I think it was great. Appreciate that.
For me, it'll be different because I think Dorothy is she's not based in Singapore, so I think when she gives us very different perspectives, especially politically wise. We had some conversations, and I realized how different Singapore is in a good way, the government. So I think she gives us very different perspective, and I appreciate that a lot because if not for this, I wouldn't know what's happening in the outside world. So maybe Dorothy can introduce herself to the audience.
Sure. My name is Dorothy Tang. I'm an assistant professor here in the landscape architecture programs at NUS. I used to practice in New York City, and then I lived in Hong Kong for a long time. And then I just recently finished my PhD at MIT looking at the role of watershed planning and geopolitics.
So Dorothy, like Dorothy mentioned, so she's based in other countries before. So how's Singapore for you so far?
Well, I had a very weird experience. I literally landed a year and 2 days ago in Singapore, and then I was whisked away to a hotel for quarantine for 2 weeks. So that was fun. And so I feel like my experience of Singapore is not what a typical, the settling in process was very slow because it was, there was quarantine, and then we went into this strange, you can only hang out with 2 people at a time situation. Yeah. And so the introduction to Singapore has been very gradual. I have to admit, there's places I haven't been yet that you'd probably be shocked. I went to the Jewel for the first time 2 weeks ago. So there are a lot of places that I feel like most people, by the time they've been in Singapore for a year, have experienced, but because of COVID, my introduction has been a bit stunted, but in a good way, because I feel like I've been exposed more to the kind of everyday life of Singapore more, just having to navigate that rather than the kind of spectacular, crazy landscapes of Singapore. So it's been great. I've really enjoyed it.
I think
food is really good.
We can bring Dorothy around if we have the opportunity.
Is there anywhere that you
guided
want to go?
tours.
Yeah.
No, I want guided tours from all of you.
Ooh,
That'll be fun.
I think it's possible. Maybe we can do something about it also, with the students. Yeah.
class outing.
Oh my god, I was gonna say sidewalk, but no.
Oh no, sidewalk.
No, that's different. Guided tours, you have to curate the experience and timing and where you're gonna get your tea and your food and all that. So
Research. All the
research.
history.
Yeah, so you're able to be like, yeah, so Dorothy, this is this, and like, oh, right here you can have really good bubble tea.
Exactly.
Okay, so moving on to the content for today. So today we'll be talking about wealth disparity and landscape. So this is like a social issue, and we're trying to bring it in to show how landscape is connected with like the rest of the world, and it's not like it by itself. So maybe I can start off with like a very simple idea of mine. So initially when I was introduced to landscape, what I thought about the past and now is very simple. So in the past I thought about landscape was more about private gardens, and those gardens owned by like the monarchy or the rich. And now how I would describe landscape would be more about public parks. So do you think that this idea of mine is concrete, or is it true that it's becoming more public for people? Is that the trend, or is it not at all like a fact?
I think landscapes are inherently public, even if they're, shut behind closed gates and things like that. And that's one of the things that attracted me to landscape architecture, is that unlike buildings that have very clearly delineated private and public spaces, landscapes are a bit more blurry, right? So even in someone's backyard, if the fence is low enough, you can still see inside. And so that, to a certain extent, is still somewhat public, right? So I feel like landscapes have always been part of the public realm, and parks and gardens are not the only types of landscapes, right? So there's a lot of working landscapes. There's a lot of other forms of public open space, and I tend to have a much more expansive view of what landscape is. And so then by doing that, you kind of expand to who has agency or who has access to these types of spaces, right? Instead of just gardens and parks.
I think also like how you view landscape as status symbol and like those kind of things. I think maybe last time gardens, they sort of symbolize like what Sherry said, monarchs, and they are kind of private gardens. But now I think when you think about it in a public realm, it still has a certain social status symbol, because when you think about Singapore being a wealthy country, you think about Gardens by the Bay, you think about Jewel. Even though it's within the public realm, it's still the status of Singapore being a first world country, and we do still cite a lot of landscape. Instead of associating them with monarchs, we associate them with the development of the country itself. So there's still a social status for the citizens of those countries. So yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit more? What do you mean by it being a status symbol for the nation, or symbol of development?
I think last time, comparing the old and the new, how medieval gardens would show how wealthy a certain family is, or a certain monarch is. Maybe that is just a smaller scale of what we see today. Like, instead of just representing a family, it actually represents an entire country. It's not the wealth of just a family, but almost an entire nation already. So like, if a country is able to have grand projects like Gardens by the Bay, the High Line, these kind of very big infrastructural projects or landscape projects, right? It shows the world stage that these countries have a certain development level, like a certain status or a certain wealth status in that sense. So they are mostly like first world countries. But at the same time, I think our definition of landscape has broadened to a sense where even working landscapes are part of landscape. And I think with that also comes certain connotation of like resource wealth. So like when you think about the rice fields of Indonesia or Philippines, it might be a country, but it shows the resources rich resources of those countries also that might be lacking in certain first world countries also. So,
I think I just want to share like a fun fact, because my friend, she studies French, so she told me like how the French monarchy actually like buy a lot of land, like they own a lot of land and they don't do anything to it. That is and just for that to show like their wealth. So being able to own land and just let it be is like the way to show wealth. And I like how this idea kind of changes with urbanization. So we build a lot of buildings, and I think a lot of perspective of cities being rich is because they have a lot of skyscrapers. And now we're trying to bring landscape in, and I think Singapore's like a good example. Like we do have a lot of skyscrapers, but on top of that, maybe like as a status symbol, we do have spaces for relaxation and for greenery, and maybe this is like another level on top of having just skyscrapers. So it shows like development over the years. So we're not just having buildings, metal structures, but we're bringing in green infrastructures for the development of the country and for the people. So it also shows some sort of good way in the sense that we're developing for the people now.
Is it because like they've already like established that okay, they're wealthy enough, they're well-to-do, they're developed, and they've really built all this great infrastructure that is meant to, let's say, kind of like help the general population in, let's say, more basic needs. So because they're good with that, they're done with that, they're wealthy enough to do that. Okay, let's bring in like the other kind of like layers that can like fit.
So
Is that the kind of
and so in some ways, like this idea of sustainability is almost like a symbol of developmentalism. Is that what you guys are getting at?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a really interesting concept called ecological modernization, which basically argues that sort of by being ecological or returning to ecological roots and green infrastructure and all the kind of sustainable things that we talk about, you're also displaying how modern your particular country or your city is, right? And so it is kind of a status symbol. But I wonder if we need to distinguish between designed landscapes versus the vernacular, right? So our designed landscapes, and this is kind of a problem because we're designers, right? Are designers part of that process of ecological modernization? Is the Singapore kind of trend of dealing with these or designing biophilic spaces and etc. also just a display of wealth? Or are there like deeper, more meaningful aspects of this kind of work versus working landscapes or vernacular landscapes that are formed by everyday processes? How do we, I wonder how we value the two and what the two different kinds of landscapes exemplify to us as designers.
I'm not so sure, but I feel that we as landscape architects play a very important role in participating in projects. So there's projects, there's policies and politics. So I feel that we need to anchor ourselves in discussions and talks, and that is where we get conversation starting and to explain to people like why is landscaping very important, like understanding why is greenery important, why do we need skyrise greenery. It may be good or it may be bad, so we need to be in discussions to get it going. But at the same time, we also cannot disregard the fact that there's those working landscapes that I think they are more like original or organic, so they happen on their own. It's not that something we can purposefully design for. So it happens both ways. We need to allow it to happen, but also at the same time, we need to be more active and participate in more talks. How about the rest of you? So do you have any idea?
I think, speaking about vernacular landscape, I think growing up in Singapore, we don't really have that much working landscape. Most of the available land, or at least since the development of Singapore, most available land has been used for economic gains or even public needs. So like your housing, your water. Most of our food is imported. We don't grow our own food. It's not feasible. But I think when you look at different countries, how they view vernacular landscape and how they view design landscape. So even in our neighboring countries, they are quite big examples of having both. They're developing countries, and most of their cities are modern, if not more modern than Singapore. They are rich, really lives a lavish lifestyle. They have social statuses that even rival Singapore, but they do have working landscapes. And I think that's where vernacular landscapes are associated with the poor, and design landscapes are viewed as the wealthy, the ones that can afford something to be designed for them, and a lot of money can be pumped in to build this kind of infrastructures and this kind of landscape. So I think that's how I view vernacular versus design. Yeah.
But what
And-
about like in a more urban landscape? So should we like democratize landscapes? So like making landscapes more available for people. Because I feel like there are like, okay, for example, golf courses, so they are very exclusive and only available to certain people of certain status. So I don't know if it sounds like golf courses are like the villains here, or like we're trying to villainize it.
I hate golf courses. It's fine.
But should we make those spaces? Should there even be this kind of spaces in Singapore, given that we have like a very small land use?
I think that's quite I don't hate golf courses, but I don't play golf. I just don't hate it because I think one of our classmates has also mentioned that golf courses, even though they are huge, take a lot of space, they aren't really used for like in a way the public. They have a lot of spaces that actually can be multi-purpose. They can actually be refurbished or redefined in certain places. So the whole thing can still be a golf course, but in certain countries, I think they actually build like plantations or like landscapes, some other things in there that the public can go in and do, even if the golf course is still like that huge golf course. And in Singapore, like when you're talking about golf courses, the first thing I think about is the huge golf courses that take up almost half of Sentosa. I think the ones that we especially in our side.
Correct.
Yeah, the reason why they have those golf courses is because it's meant to cater to the wealthy.
Yeah.
The wealthy in Sentosa Cove, because that's kind of like also like their place. And some of the things that like when we read up, we'll see about how like wealthy individuals in Singapore, why they are so wealthy and why they're in Sentosa and why Sentosa is the place for this, because a bit of like not really say completely the government, but also at the same time Singapore is trying to show itself to the world that it's a wealthy country, and it wants to attract this kind of like high net worth individuals to come, stay, and contribute to like the national interest and national wealth. And I feel like yes, it's a bit superficial because yes, we're trying to balance it, the economic, like we want more money and more interest, more wealth into the country, but at the same time also I guess there's a balance.
So were you serious? Is that what that was about? Okay.
It's just something I was reading. I was very, very interested. I was like, oh, I didn't know that Singapore was doing this and like trying to attract this kind of people in with our like social status, because they are trying to like show people like, oh, when you're rich, come here, put your investments with us. It's gonna be safe and you're gonna have a really nice place to live in. Yeah, but going back to the original thing about how the golf courses can be redefined, I think that's also like an idea. I mean, even us landscape architects can also like go into. So
I think speaking about golf courses, I think golf courses in Singapore in particular, I'm not sure if it happens in other countries. In Singapore in particular, it's actually kind of interesting because they are actually dual purpose in a sense that the golf courses, I mean not the ones in Sentosa and Singapore Island, but those golf courses near the airport, they are particularly there because the land around the airport has to be maintained and shot with no trees. Yeah, because of the airplane landing, right? So particularly,
and it's okay if rich people have,
so
go deaf by golfing.
Yeah, exactly.
Right
So it's like
dual
dual purpose. Like the government needs the land to be cleared and maintained, and golf courses are maintained and are shot with no trees.
it's like
So-
two birds with one.
Yeah, so it's like killing two birds with one
Yeah,
stone.
exactly.
But I don't see that in other countries, definitely not. But yeah, in Singapore, it's kind of interesting. Like fun fact about golf courses in the east, and this huge amount of land of golf courses.
But it sounds to me that the argument is not whether golf courses themselves, in of themselves, are moral or not. It's more what is the context of these golf courses and who has access to it, right? And so there is examples. For example, in Hong Kong has a huge housing shortage, and so there's a huge controversy. I think like 3 years ago when the housing authority decided that they were going to convert an old historic colonial era golf course into housing, and then people were like, well, how dare you take away golf from us and build housing instead. But it was because Hong Kong had this huge shortage. So when we put those things, I think, in perspective and in context, it's maybe not about whether these landscapes should have public access or are democratic, but it's a question of distribution, right? Who has access? What are the needs of Singapore as a city-state with bounded, landscapes. And how do you then justify whether or not these types of needs are necessary or beneficial for the population? Right. So if there were a lot of rich people here, maybe they do need golf. But at the same time, does that limit access to these types of landscapes for other people? Right. So I think that's really the question. It's not the golf course themselves, but also sort of thinking about, who are the people that have access? Why don't they have access? And when we propose a certain kind of use or a landscape, what is being displaced during that process?
I think one good point that Latif mentioned was about maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like the reason why golf courses is like, it's a recreational sport for people, but at the same time, it's also about, I question myself about like maintenance, because there's like public and private partnerships, and it keeps this power relationship that the government has and the private companies have.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's good that there is some sort of maintenance happening and it keeps it going. So I was thinking like if this public-private partnership can happen for public parks, because maintenance itself is a difficult thing because you need money for it.
Mm-hmm.
So in Singapore's case, maybe we do have N parks to help with it. But for overseas, are there any cases of like public parks being not able to sustain themselves?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
A lot.
And
Central Park, for example, in the 1970s was dilapidated. It was crime-ridden. There was, graffiti everywhere, and it fell into disrepair because the city basically went bankrupt. And so the 70s and 80s was a very dark time for Central Park. And it wasn't until later on when the city finally was trying to attract the rich people to come back and started fundraising, that they basically were able to make up that maintenance budget for Central Park through private donations. But it also meant that a small group of wealthy people had access to certain kinds of things and privileges over a public park. So my question is more about, whose responsibility is it to maintain these kinds of spaces? And when a government is bankrupt, and yes, Singapore is super wealthy, and so, N parks can maintain all our landscapes, but in other parts of the world, there's just simply not the budget there, and the first thing to go is landscapes. So then, is it a good choice to bring in private entities to sort of have corporate sponsorships and naming rights and all that? That I think needs a little bit more thought. So while you can maintain a landscape and make it work, but at the same time, like, what are we losing when we pawn off our public spaces to be maintained and operated and policed by private entities? Do they have the public's welfare or public good really in mind, or are we just giving up something that we can't recover in the future?
I'm not so sure about like what to lose, but as a user of those places myself, like those spaces that are owned by real estate companies, so they have their own buildings, shopping malls there, and then they have like some extra spaces which they set up tables for people. So it's always very stressful for me when I go to those spaces, because there's always like a time limit, and then or like someone will be waiting for your seats, and then they will tell you like, oh, we're closed at 10 p.m, so you have to like vacate, although it's like a public space, it's like right outside a shopping mall. So I feel like as a user myself, this is something like for maybe I'm very as an individual, so it's something that I have to lose, but I'm not so sure if like for the general public.
It actually happened in our current studio sidewalk. So we're doing the southern waterfront, right? So there's actually a stretch by Keppel Bay that is actually owned by the individual developments. So like the private condominium developments, they actually own segments of the public walkway that connects Harbourfront to Labrador Park. And what you lose there is that there is this tiny signboard over there that says all the things that you can't do on their private property, and that actually includes cycling.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so this was actually brought up by our Prof Irvin. He waveboarded there, and one of the cyclists was actually stopped. Not him, but another cyclist was stopped by the security guard because you're not allowed to cycle on private property even though it's not gated. So that is where I think the compromise comes in. So in essence, I think what happened is that the land authority, Singapore Land Authority, sold this as waterfront property, but you have to have this amount of land so that people can walk through. But because it's private property, they get to choose the rules and they get to oversee what goes on to their.
But aren't Singaporean parks also full of rules that you can't do this,
Yeah.
you
That's
can't
true,
do that?
that's true.
I mean, how is that different?
Yeah.
But I think because he mentioned about cycling, it's also quite important because it limits certain usage of the space. So especially cycling is very important in Singapore because we're trying to promote like healthier living and there's so many park connectors. But losing this stretch of waterfront area, will it actually affect like urban planning? Maybe not such like a big scale, but maybe they have to reroute their roads.
cycling routes or
Like
something.
park connectors cannot go through these spaces and then to try to reroute. So maybe that's something we have to give up if we were to sell those spaces to public entities.
Private.
Private.
Public.
Then do you think like how should we move on from here, like as landscape architects? Should we participate more in like policy making? Is project sufficient?
I don't know.
Where should we move on? Like how can we try to bridge the gap between the wealthy and those who are actually in need of these spaces?
So a concept that all of you sort of mentioned earlier was this idea that landscape is kind of a commodity, right? So whether it's extracted for economic gain or we're using it to maintain our watersheds and stuff like that, like it's all, part of that process. And I wonder if we're thinking of landscape and equity, I wonder if we need to change the way that we think about landscapes and move beyond thinking of them as a commodity, right? But that they're a different kind of resource that doesn't have monetary value. And when we free landscape from that particular perspective, then maybe we can talk about what kind of rights people have in terms of accessing these types of spaces. Right? And because the moment we say landscape is a commodity, then we have limited, only certain people have access to it, they have ownership over it. So if we're really interested in democratizing landscape, it's not about who makes decisions about what, but how, I guess it is about decision making, but it's also freeing it from its commodified kind of self.
So maybe like instead of seeing it as like a park, we can see like that green space that brings more mental stability for us.
I think in essence it's making landscapes into public goods, right? That is not bounded by any. I think in political sense, a public good is always open to everyone, and
Right.
there's no limit to who is able to use and things like that. But currently, it's not being seen as a public good because parks are tied to land, and land is a commodity, right? Is that how currently the urban fabric
Well,
is?
I mean, are parks not? I mean, do you think that parks are not a public good? Like,
I think once you tie it to land and who owns that land, then that's where
but
the
if a
issue
public
comes.
park is owned by the government or the state, isn't that by definition a public space? You look very devious.
But
You're
I
like,
think
that
then-
doesn't make sense.
But I think then that it goes back to what you said about Central Park, right? When you bring in, so how much percentage is that land actually owned by the government once the private entity
Well, I mean,
comes in?
there's a difference though. So in this case, Central Park, the land is still public, right? But the difference is that the people that maintain it and run it and operate it are a private nonprofit conservancy, right? So when, for example, a company comes in and they name, a bench or whatever in order to fundraise so that you can build a park or maintain it. When we give naming rights to these private entities as a form of advertisement, like what do we lose something there, or is that okay? What do you guys
I
think?
think that's okay
It's
because
okay also, to be very honest, like
is that the way forward? Like to have the government to own the land, but for the private entities to maintain it? Is that the way forward?
I don't know. What do you guys think?
if you're talking about in Singapore, then like you said, Singapore like and parks the kind, they are rich, you don't really need these
Yeah,
private-
that's true.
Or let's say even if they do have like this kind of like private.
But what if Coca-Cola decides that they're going to, renovate a park and parks and call it Coca-Cola Park? What do you think?
I think that'd be funny. I mean, oh my god, you're gonna go to Coca-Cola Park. I don't see like I lose much here, to be very, very honest. Like on the personal level, my family level, my friends level, like I find that it's fine, even if they want to do that. Because
I think that's where all the stakeholders come into place when talking about this kind of projects. So the landscape architects come in and say like how maybe for the ecology side, how good is it for the environment, and then there's going to be like the urban planners who comes in and say how maybe this park fits into the context of the site. But there's also the private entities who they still have a say because they're still funding these projects, and we'll see maybe they'll reach like a certain consensus through it, more discussions.
So I guess for me, I feel like whoever has the money has the power. And so even if it is a public space, but it's funded by a private entity, then they have a say over what it should be, what it can be, and what happens on it.
Do we hold them back? Are landscape
Can all governments hold them back?
Yeah, that's true. I don't really
the
think.
money, sure, I don't think they can hold them back.
I mean, let me just give you an example. There's plenty of cases in China, for example, where landscapes are built and they're funded by private companies or developers in exchange for zoning variances. So higher FARs or floor area ratios, a higher density, bigger buildings. And so it's not, I think that the privatization of these public spaces is not always in the public interest. Or you might think, oh, well, what's the big deal if this developer gets to build like a 60-story tower instead of a 20-story tower? But that's an example of privilege that I think we need to be careful about when we're making these trades of what a public good should be, who's providing those public goods, and if money equals power, what does that power relationship tell us about our cities, right? So I think that Singapore maybe doesn't have those same issues because, again, Singapore's rich. Like we acknowledge that. But at the same time, in other parts of the world where this kind of rampant privatization is occurring, I do wonder if we're losing something in terms of access, in terms of publicness, and in terms of really thinking about the public good in that sense.
And I think this maybe ties back to how we can change, like we need more landscape architects in policy making because we will discuss more and we'll have more structural change. So it's like trying to change what people think about green spaces right now. So they're not just accessories to buildings. So if we come into the talk and we tell them like the importance of these green spaces, I hope that we can maybe change their perspective of landscape architects and like our projects, and maybe for like the government to change their mind, and slowly maybe the private entities to start to realize the importance of these green spaces, so that we are not in the situation where like if you have money then you make more sense or like have more control over things. So maybe that's how we can be part of the ecosystem.
Well, maybe going a step further is starting to think about where that wealth is distributed. So the problem with privatizing or private funding going into public spaces is that the private entity would only invest in a public space if it's beneficial to them.
Yeah.
So what you see is that typically a lot of this wealth is only concentrated in certain wealthy areas rather than areas that might need that kind of funding, right? So as a designer, as a policymaker, I think the question is about distribution, right? It's perhaps, putting in policies in place to prevent that kind of privatization, but it's also being aware of how these public-private partnerships also generate disparate kind of urban zones or disparate spaces throughout the city.
Do you have any final thoughts about this issue?
Anybody want to defend golf courses?
I don't play golf, so I'm fine.
No, but I think golf is still okay. Not that I play it, but I mean, maybe it's still like a recreational sport, and I think people are still following it. So it's not. I mean, if like I played badminton last time, so if you're going to remove a badminton court, then I will be angry about it. So, but it's not like as big of a scale as like golf courses, so maybe that's why it's not a problem. But I think what we can take away from this conversations here is about distribution, about it. Like maybe we don't have like 5 or 10 golf courses within Singapore because we don't have the space for it. Maybe 1 or 2 is good enough. But it's about how we as landscape architects put ourselves into the discussion, let people know about how we can change things and why green spaces are important, and work with the all the stakeholders and try to see where we can reach like a consensus. Yeah.
You're gonna have to be like very convincing because like I think, to be very honest, in the real world, yeah, when you hold a lot of wealth, usually you hold a lot of power as well. And like you were saying, how these kind of people would kind of like want to only, not saying want to benefit themselves only, but usually they see how it can benefit their company.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be convincing enough, and you need to know how to say things such like, okay, oh, so if you actually spread like this distribution or like this kind of like development in a certain area, it's gonna be pretty good for your company as well. And I think you're gonna have to be like pretty good at talking about that as well. Yeah, not only about the benefits, because maybe they might not care so much. I'm not really sure.
I just think that we need to have a more nuanced approach, right? And so, for example, like if rich, wealthy companies want to pay for stuff, then we should take advantage of it.
Yeah.
But then also ensure it's fair distribution.
Yes.
So, I know I sound extremely cynical about this, and it's kind of we're taking a cynical view about sort of private involvement in public spaces. But I do think that we need to kind of see where the wind blows, take advantage of it when we need to, because there are places where, frankly, it's really difficult to find resources to maintain parks. And as we all know, it's not just the construction of a park or a public space that is important, but the maintenance of it is even more important in order to maintain it as part of the public realm. So, I don't know. There's no good answer.
Any thoughts as like a political science second major students?
So I think for me personally, I think for me I see having very good governance in a nation state is also very important, you know. Being policymaker, but at the same time I think it's also being present, like as practitioners of the built environment, you know, you have to be present even within the very difficult political scenes. You know, we have to
Make a scene.
make a scene, like stand up for what we think is right. So I think that's also very important.
Conviction.
Yeah, yes, definitely.
That's true.
I think maybe I can tie everything together. So from what I also recall from like another geography mod that I took, so my professor mentioned about like how power relations can be changed. So I don't want to make it sound like we have a very bleak future where, you know, only money can change things, but I hope that, you know, moving forward, like we need to establish more of ourselves, like start to structurally change things up, to let the government or like private entities to know why certain public spaces are important and how actually we as landscape architects can start to change things.
That's really interesting.
That's
insight.
very idealistic, I feel, compared to the rest of you guys, your point of view.
Money is power. No, I think that's a really good way to end, is this idea that as designers, as policymakers, that we start thinking about how we insert ourselves for structural change. And I think that's really important to think of landscapes in that way.
So maybe to end this video, I feel like we touched on wealth disparity, but more on how money changes things. But definitely, I feel like there's way forward. There's a way forward for us to change things. That's on like the brighter side of things. So I hope that we as landscape architects, we can slowly bridge the difference between the income gap and not be like the separator of things. So maybe that's like more on the positive note. Yeah.
Well, thank you. That's a good way to end this.
Thank you so much, people.
Thank
And
you
I
so
hope that you
much.
have enjoyed this video. So, moving on, we have more videos to come on like touching on social topics, touching on like sustainability. So we hope that you can follow us more on this series for Landscape Architecture Podcast. And we have more guests to come, like so Dorothy is like one of the full-time professors in our school. So we have more of them coming to join us on this series, and we hope to see you guys around. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.